Fantasy baseball also presents the unique challenge of balancing your hitting and your pitching. Dick Whalen from RotoWire. Today, I'm going to give you 4 tips that the experts use to dominate their fantasy baseball leagues. Number 1, make sure you know the player pool from top to bottom. Just about any competitive draft that you're going to be participating in this season, there's going to be a timer. Oftentimes it's 1 minute, but could be as little as 30 seconds. Either way, you're not going to have time to conduct research on the fly on every potential option when you're on the clock. It's imperative to know the player pool like the back of your hand before going into any fantasy baseball draft. And that doesn't just apply to the top 100 or the top 150 guys. Any good fantasy baseball player will tell you they oftentimes win leagues in the middle rounds, if not the later rounds. So you got to identify holes on your roster, categories you might need to shore up as the draft goes along, and you're able to quickly identify targets who fit your build if you're familiar with the player pool. I would recommend checking out our updated depth charts at RotoWire, player pages for news, cross-reference your individual rankings with those of our experts over at RotoWire. The tools are out there, but make sure you budget the time before your draft to make sure your knowledge is where it needs to be. Number 2, know your league's settings. This is extremely important in any fantasy league, but especially in fantasy baseball. Just about any fantasy football league you're in, it's going to operate pretty similarly, but in fantasy baseball, you tend to have a lot more variance. With that said, the majority of leagues are what we call 5x5 category leagues. 5 categories on the hitting side, 5 on the pitching side. The most common categories for hitting are steals, runs, RBI, home run, and batting average. For pitching, we're talking wins, strikeouts, saves, ERA, and WHIP. However, some leagues might add an extra category like OBP or slugging percentage. Other leagues may simply replace batting average with OBP to try to more closely replicate how a real-life team might function. It's extremely vital to familiarize yourself with your league scoring settings before the draft. Something like a switch from batting average to OBP can make a huge difference for certain hitters, especially those with extremely high or extremely low walk rates. Beyond scoring settings, you also need to know your roster settings. It's just as important, if not even more important, when it comes to draft strategy. Are you in a 1-catcher league or is it a 2-catcher league? Make sure you know, because that could have a major impact on how you build your team. How many starting outfielders do you need? Do you have a utility spot you need to fill? Are you required to start a certain number of starters, a certain number of relievers? Is there a pitching innings minimum that you have to meet? These are all questions that you should be asking yourself as you're preparing for your drafts. Trying to figure all that out on the fly when you're on the clock, you got to make a pick. It's no fun. Before we get to number 3 on the list, you want a competitive edge in your fantasy baseball draft this season? Go check out our expert rankings, get our premium analysis, and all the best tools in the game. Sign up now for a free trial at rotowire.com/try. All right, number 3, when you're going through a draft, you want to find a balance between risk and reward. And this may seem obvious, and yeah, it applies to just about any fantasy draft, but it's important to assess your goals in a given league right off the bat. Is it a standalone league with maybe 10 or only 12 teams? Is your league part of an overall contest like you might see at the NFBC? Your goal, always, of course, is to win the league. But if you're playing in a league with an overall component, maybe you'll be a bit more aggressive in attacking risk, as you're not only looking to win your individual league, but you're trying to place as high as you can in the overall contest. And that can include, hundreds of other teams. In order to take down a contest like that, some level of risk is almost always going to have to be involved. So when it comes to assessing risk, injury-prone players are by far the key component here. Pitchers returning from Tommy John surgery, for instance, players like Mike Trout or Royce Lewis, who seem to spend half of every season on the IL. These are decisions that you'll have to make at some point in your draft. Are you going to take the risk or are you going to pass? My advice, if you invest in a risky player or two in the first half of your draft, I try to balance it out with some quote unquote safer veterans as much as I can, or at least, find some semblance of safety at the position later in a draft. If you take, say, a second baseman or a shortstop who has some upside but has a track record of missing time, make sure that the backup at the position is a more dependable option you can throw in whenever your riskier starter inevitably does miss games. Ultimately, you're going to have to take some risks at some point in just about every draft, but you don't want to veer too far into that and end up taking yourself out of contention. This is where knowing the player pool really helps. So you don't want to be scrambling mid-draft, trying to find out who's risky, who's not risky. Make a list. Do it before the draft. Write down certain players who, okay, if they fall to me at a certain spot, maybe I'll take that risk, but I'm not jumping ADP for those guys. Our 4th and final tip, do what you can to build a balanced roster. Now, there are exceptions to just about every rule, but most fantasy managers will tell you that in a category league, they are looking for balance. Punting categories, it could be done, but requires a very specific strategy and can be difficult to pull off, especially if you're an amateur player. So in general, you want to do what you can to build a balanced roster, one that's particularly strong in a few categories, but more importantly, isn't perilously weak in others. So if you load up on a bunch of power bats early on, sure, you'll likely end up with plenty of home runs, you'll get RBI, but chances are you'll be struggling in batting average, you'll be struggling in steals, as those categories typically don't correlate. Of course, it's very difficult to end up with a perfectly balanced team. Some exceptions will need to be made, but if you start with those power bats, consider making a point to shore up your average as the draft goes along. Another example would be steals, which could be a difficult category. If you don't have any high steal players on your roster early on, that's something you'll need to go out of your way to address in the middle rounds of the draft. High steals players can be very difficult to identify later in drafts and off of the waiver wire. So if you don't do it in the middle rounds, if you don't do it in the early rounds, then you might be stuck without steals and you're trying to scramble to grab them off the waiver wire. Fantasy baseball also presents the unique challenge of balancing your hitting and your pitching. You don't really find that in other fantasy sports. It can almost be viewed completely separately. It can be tempting to load up on one versus the other, but it's vital to stay disciplined throughout your draft and try to sense when you might be a little bit overweight on hitting or a little overweight on pitching and try to balance that out as your draft progresses. Lastly, keep in mind that most leagues include saves as a category. So keep in mind that you'll likely want to come away with at least 2 closers who you feel good about. You could be more aggressive in that category if you want, but of course, the more draft capital that you're spending on closers, the less you're spending on starters, the less you're spending on hitting. All right, those are 4 basic strategy tips that the experts use to find success in their fantasy baseball leagues. Go check out all of our tools over at rotowire.com. And again, our analysis, our rankings, all the best tools in the game. You can sign up now for a free trial at rotowire.com/try.